A mob of people descend on the White House to go to this house party, essentially. And you've got like farmers, people from the local pub just rolling in.
At the White House.
Donald Trump returning to office.
We are standing by to hear from Vice President Kamala Harris.
Results that came in Pennsylvania.
Donald Trump will become
the podcast election, which just happened.
Trump in particular went all in, right? For
a while.
Kamala Harris, she got on Shannon Sharp's podcast. The U.S. government literally goes in and divides up the South into various military districts.
Wasn't there a president who was never elected?
Gerald Ford.
Who are the bottom 3 presidential rankings?
So right now, I just double-checked this morning.
I'd love to get right into it even.
Sure, yeah. I think that's a great place to start.
So I think what's so exciting about you is you're the coolest history teacher. I call you a historian.
Yes.
So everything that we're about to discuss is going to be educational, informative, and we're going to learn from the best of the best, which is really exciting for me.
Listen, happy to be here.
I haven't been to school in so long. So for me to update my knowledge about stuff is really exciting, and you being an expert in your field
Sure, yes.
is a joy for me. And I think a joy for everybody listening.
I'm happy to be here. Happy to always do this. I'm always shocked because you have these like big name celebrities, and it's like, oh my God, he's got guy from The Office. Here's Jen from Bachelor, and then Jimmy.
Jimmy, the best history teacher on the planet. But you mentioned the podcast selection, which just happened.
Yeah. Okay. So we obviously are recording this post-election. We know the results at this point. But I think one of the like most interesting takeaways from this election was the fact that podcasting really was the primary vessel that the candidates spoke to the American people.
This is the first time where mainstream media really took a back seat to now something controlled by more of just the people.
Completely, yeah. I mean, Trump in particular just went all in, right? For
a while.
For a long time, yeah. I mean, obviously, Joe Rogan podcast and his appearance there was like the biggest example of that. J.D. Vance, Elon Musk also going on that Joe Rogan podcast shortly thereafter. But he was on like a Barstool podcast. He was on the Undertaker's podcast, which I think is very funny.
6 Feet Under. I think his first one was the Impulsive one. That was kind of what sparked a lot of his podcast interest.
Yeah, and he's got, Aiden Ross and some of the Twitch streamers.
Yeah, he did live streams.
Yes, totally. And Kamala Harris, took a little bit of heat for not doing quite as many, but even she got on Shannon Sharp's podcast. But yeah, so it was super interesting. I was thinking about it. I mean, obviously you're a podcaster. You think you would interview presidential candidates in the future if you got the opportunity?
If I had the opportunity, I'd love to. I wouldn't be as informed, but I'd do all my research to figure out what everybody wants to know. And Joe Rogan made a huge point about the fact that just doing a podcast, you get to see how somebody ticks, whether they're calculated, whether they're impulsive, whether they're not sure. Maybe they're able to be humble and be like, I have to do more research on this. Or they'll just throw out things. And that was a huge thing, I think, for this election.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even not only the fact that the candidates leaned into going on podcast, but also the fact that they leaned out of doing the more traditional avenues. I mean, we obviously only had one presidential debate between Kamala and Trump.
In history, is that rare?
It is rare, yeah. I mean, typically, since, the 60s and 70s when television starts to become a thing for presidential elections, certainly in the modern era, I always remembered it as you did 3. You had 3 presidential elections and then 1 3 presidential debates and then 1 VP debate. So 4 total. And it all happened in like October. So it's like rapid fire.
And normally in that first one, there's more than just the Republican Democrat. There's a couple independents.
Right. So what you're talking about is our primary debates. The primary debates happen like starting a year out. And that's where you got like a stage potentially of, 10 people, 12 people. Some of the recent ones have been massive. And then, it gets whittled down over time. You eventually, come up with who your nominees are. Unlikely in the modern era, just with how our 2 major political parties operate, that you would have a third party candidate on the stage. RFK notably was like really trying to be that third party candidate this time around. And was effectively shut out by both the Democrats and the Republicans. But yeah, so that, you whittle it down, you get your 2. What's more is those 3 presidential debates, if you remember, typically you have like a standard one. So, podium, both people looking at each other talking or whatever. Then you had a sit down one where the candidates are like sitting at a table discussing
face to face,
and there's a moderator as well. It's like a round table thing. And then if I'm remembering correctly, usually the last one is a town hall where the candidates are standing and kind of walking around and there's people all around them. And we didn't have any of that this year, right? Like they did the first one. Depending on your political perspective, you might have walked away with a different opinion. I think the majority take was that Kamala did pretty well for herself in that first one. But yeah, Trump showed little interest in having another debate. Kamala showed little interest in having another debate, and then they just didn't. And that's when I think the podcast really picked up here.
Do your students discuss politics a lot in your class?
Sure. So, I mean, the class I'm teaching right now is Honors U.S. History, and the way that I put that together is it's a discussion-based class. So, like, yeah, I lecture probably more than my students want me to, but you know, at least on average, like once a week, I'm having them discuss something in a Socratic seminar type format, and you know, we're trying to discuss current events and things like that. So, what I find interesting is I feel like with most students, they're not necessarily coming out in support of a candidate, right? Like I feel like it's kind of rare in my experience to talk with like a high school student who's like, I'm a Kamala Harris stan, or like I'm a MAGA, you know, Trump Republican. But they do have a lot of ideas and thoughts on the issues themselves. So even if maybe they haven't identified this is my candidate, like they have opinions on things. And it's like my favorite part of the class is like getting to have them you know, educate me on perspectives. I learn new things all the time from students.
Were high school students swaying one way or another in your area?
So I can say specifically how my students were swaying, because early in the year we do a political, essentially like a political party quiz or whatever. And you might have done this when you were in high school, where you like answer questions and it tells you like, oh, you're a Democrat, you're a Republican. Pew Research Center has a really good one that I like. And it's a little more nuanced than just like right, left. They break it down. I would say, so I got 5 classes. 3 of them were pretty balanced. One of them was far on the right wing side of things. And then one of them was like almost everyone was on the left. So it's fun getting a sense of like where my students are coming from.
Are they all the same grade?
All the same grade. All 11th graders, yeah.
Crazy.
I would say like probably the most popular political category that my students fall in all the years that I've done this is just right of center. So the Pew Research calls it the ambivalent right, meaning that they're probably a little more like slightly social conservative, slightly. But they're also a group that is defined by not being super interested in politics that much, and also a group that's not super like checked into politics, which makes a lot of sense. Obviously, like you're talking about 16 and 17-year-olds, makes sense that the majority of them probably aren't super dialed into it yet.
Do you have any students trying to run for political?
Not to my knowledge. I don't know. Any students watching, I'd love to know if you have political aspirations. But yeah. Oh, you know what? I do have on my whiteboard right now a poll that was put up of who should be president, and it's got a couple of my 6th period students and then me as well. And I actually think I won the election. So
I hope you would win.
I would hope so. I would hope so too. So 6th period has my back. I think that they would vote for me. I don't know about the rest of my classes.
25 votes in your pocket.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So how is this election different from previous elections in the past?
Yeah, no, I mean, the thing that jumps out to me immediately is the obvious, which is that we had such a late in the game switch of one of the main candidates.
Has that ever happened before? It
definitely happened. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I mean, obviously, okay, I'm thinking of like 1968. You have Lyndon B. Johnson, who in, I believe, March of that year ends up dropping out of the race. And that's an election year, right? So like November, they're going to vote. And he says, I'm out. I'm not going to do it. But obviously that's 68. So it's been quite a long time. It doesn't happen often. So the fact that, Biden ends up dropping out, Kamala comes in late in the game. We had a really condensed election cycle this year of only like a couple of months. So that's different. And also the fact that Trump has made, and at this point successfully made, a political comeback. Doesn't happen all that often. I mean, typically if you are defeated in an election, that's a sign to the political parties that kind of control things. They're like, all right, this guy or this woman is a loser. Like, we're not going to come back to them. Trump being in office, then being voted out, and then defeating the candidate to get back in the very next election cycle. That has happened before, but not since Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison in the late 1880s and early 1890s. So
he lost and came back 4 years later?
Yeah, so Grover Cleveland is the other president who is like Trump, who won an election, then lost an election, and then beat that guy that he lost to get back in 1892.
What party was he affiliated with?
Cleveland was a Democrat, and Benjamin Harrison was a Republican. It was a time period where federal politics, like the presidential level politics, kind of had taken a back seat. It wasn't as dynamic, I would say, as it is today, certainly. But yeah, it's been a second since we've had that type of switch. So I would say, this election is very unorthodox, just because while there has been some examples of these things happening, it's been a long time.
In those early 1900s elections,
yeah,
how long would it take for the states to figure out who won the counties to say who won the president? Because now we're finding out the night of.
Sure, yeah. we often don't find out the night of, right? It was funny, I think back to like 2012 when I was in high school, and my high school history teacher hosted like an election night watch party, after school. And I remember going to that, and by like 6:30 we had known Obama won in 2012. And now it's like late at night, or last time around in 2020 it was a couple days later. But yeah, to your point, right? Certainly back in the 1900s, 1800s, 1700s, it would take, weeks to tally up votes, and then obviously months to like get that information out to people. Now, I should also say a lot fewer people voted then. So that's going to lower the overall vote totals, which will probably make up for the fact that technology is obviously not as quick back then. But yeah, we were able to conduct elections even without the high-speed internet that we have today and all that stuff.
Would there be election fraud back then?
Sure, yeah. So, in fact, an election in 1876, you have Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. Super contentious election. Were essentially, long story short, both sides, both parties, both presidential nominees claimed to be the winner, and they it looked like Tilden had won, who was the Democrat, but Hayes had claimed to be the winner and made claims that there was electoral college voter fraud. And they ended up working out a deal. It becomes known as the Compromise of 1877, where the Democrats basically say, all right, Hayes, you can have the presidency. We'll give up this fight. In return, though, we want Reconstruction to end. And this was the big Reconstruction era coming after the Civil War. And that's kind of what is the final nail in the coffin for Reconstruction, unfortunately, is this deal to settle that election dispute.
What is Reconstruction?
So Reconstruction is the period that comes right after the Civil War, right, where, as the name would suggest, right, we're trying to put the country back together. This is what Lincoln initially is kind of spearheading, and then he's shot. Spoiler alert. And then, yeah, I know, breaking news, Lincoln shot in the head at Ford's Theater. And so then you get his VP, Andrew Johnson, who is like kind of the polar opposite of Lincoln. Lincoln's a Republican, and he's a anti-slavery Republican, right? Andrew Johnson is a Democrat. He's what's called a Northern Democrat. So he didn't join with the Confederacies. He stays with the Union, but he's very much like, kind of pro-slavery. He's a known white supremacist. He's very much the opposite of Lincoln. And now all of a sudden he's in charge of putting the country back together. He ends up drawing the ire of Republicans in Congress, and then Republicans in Congress called radical Republicans. They end up taking over, and they pursue Reconstruction in their own vision going forward. Probably the biggest aspect of radical Republican Reconstruction is this thing called military Reconstruction, where the U.S. government literally goes in and divides up the South into various military districts and has the military occupy the South. So, you're probably familiar with like us occupying Japan after World War II for a couple of years. We essentially occupy our own country with our military.
The North occupies the South.
Exactly. To make sure that the South is implementing, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, things that are like ending slavery and providing more rights for black people.
And would they arrest people who didn't comply?
That was the idea, right? Like arrest and overseeing elections. You see a huge influx of black politicians winning elected office in the South right after the Civil War. And in large part, it's because the military's there to make sure that the black American population in the South can actually vote. Once Reconstruction ends in that election that I was just mentioning, the military is moved out of the South, and it allows for kind of old Southern racist habits to kind of pop back up again. And regretfully, you see this is where you get into the Jim Crow era. You get segregation. You get a rolling back of a lot of rights that had been won after the Civil War. So yeah, it's unfortunate that Reconstruction has ended because of this election dispute, because it obviously kind of casts millions of people in the South into a situation that is marginally better than what they were in before the Civil War.
With the North and the South, did they each have their own currency?
So a currency at this point is there's a lot of disputes in the late 1800s over what our currency is based on, whether it's going to be based on gold or silver. To my knowledge, I believe that they are using the same currency at this time period, but to be honest, I'd have to brush up on it. I'm not certain.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
What was the military in the 1800s paid?
Yes. Yeah, paid. Doesn't mean that everyone liked fighting, though. I mean, notably during the Civil War, Lincoln institutes a draft, and as with all drafts in all time periods of history, it's not popular at all. There's famously in New York City the New York draft riots, where you have a bunch of essentially working class white Americans who start to riot and burn the city down because they're upset with this draft. Regretfully, they also start targeting black Americans in the South, or excuse me, in the North, in New York, because they're essentially saying, you are the reason that we are forced to fight now, and we don't want to fight, right? And I think that's the other thing that a lot of people maybe don't understand about the Union during the Civil War is you have a ton of people in the North who are not animated by trying to end slavery. They don't care. They might have prejudice against black people themselves. So this idea that everyone in the North was fighting this moral fight to end slavery is just not true. And Lincoln largely has to balance people who are kind of more interested in preserving the Union, but if that means keeping slavery, they're okay with that, right? And then you do have abolitionists who are very much trying to fight to end slavery. But you have those two groups in the North that have to be balanced here. It makes his job incredibly difficult. It's why he's usually viewed as one of the top-ranked presidents, because he's effectively managing this crisis and dealing with all these different types of people.
During our Civil War, are other countries aware that we're going through this? Is
Yes.
Britain involved at all?
Right. Okay. So, really interesting question. This is one of the South's main goals in the early part of the war, is to try and get places like Britain and France involved. Yeah. I don't want to oversell it. I don't think that you would see a scenario where Britain and France are sending their troops to fight, right? But certainly when it comes to providing financial support, providing trade, perhaps providing weapons, military support in that sense, the South was hoping to leverage their monopoly on cotton production and basically tell Britain and France and maybe other places around the world, and Europe in particular, hey, if you want cotton still, if you're hoping to buy cheap cotton from us, you better hope we win, because the North is going to completely revolutionize the economy and, obviously get rid of the system that is perpetuating cotton production. And about halfway through the war, once it seems clear that the South is starting to lose command of this war a little bit, once as well, the Lincoln comes out with the Emancipation Proclamation about halfway through the war, and he says very openly and clearly that we're not only fighting for the Union, but we're fighting to end slavery. That kind of shuts the door on Britain or France getting involved. It was this weird thing where Britain and France would have been interested in helping the South, but not if the war became clearly about slavery. If Britain and France could make the argument that we're just supporting them because of states' rights, or we're just supporting them because of economic ties, they might have done that. But as soon as it becomes a moral conflict, they're not looking to support that any longer.
Let's take it back even a little earlier.
Okay.
When we broke free from England,
Sure.
were they upset that we were no longer owned by them now?
You're talking about Britain?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So
at what point does that ease up?
Yeah, great question. So kind of late 1800s, you start to get an easing of tensions between Britain and America, but very much so in the first few decades of American history, Britain and America are not on good terms, right?
Are we still shooting at each other?
So, I mean, you have the War of 1812, everyone's favorite war that they definitely didn't forget about, which sees Britain and America fight again. Famously, Britain invades America. We're fighting on American soil. It's like a sequel to the American Revolution.
Sequel to 1776.
Yeah, sequel to 1776. Britain actually ends up burning the White House down.
Wait, what?
Yeah, they sack the Capitol. They burn the White House, the original White House, to the ground.
In D.C.
Yeah, and they end up having to, obviously America has to end up putting that back together afterwards. So that war comes to an end in 1814. It's funny because it's kind of a draw. Both America and Britain don't really get what they want out of that conflict.
What did they want?
I mean, primarily it's a dispute over trade. America is kind of upset because after the American Revolution, there's a lot of forts out in the American West, like in modern day Ohio and Michigan and stuff, that Britain said, oh yeah, after the war, we'll totally move out and we'll let you have that area. And then they don't. And so you got redcoats just sitting out there on the frontier, and America's like, are you going to deal with this? Are you going to get rid of these people? And they're like, nah, we don't care. We're going to leave them there. And so that's creating hard feelings, of course. And anyway, though, so insofar as Britain might have hoped to have reclaimed any territory or, kind of pushed American expansion back to the eastern coast, I don't think Britain was in their wildest dreams expecting to reclaim the colonies, but maybe put them in their place. That didn't happen. It's more or less a draw. But what I think is funny is a lot of Americans, even though it's a draw, they end up coming out of this period. America has increased and surging feelings of nationalism, and they're all stoked on themselves and feel like they just proved themselves again on the world stage. Was
it the world stage at that point?
Sure, yeah. I mean, at this point,
Japan's aware of what's happening.
Well, I mean, obviously less aware than in the
current day.
The current day, of course. But this is after the age of exploration. This is at a point where countries in Europe have colonized large parts of the world. So information is traveling around.
I just picture it being really gossipy. Japan finds out what?
Yeah, what? War? Are you kidding me?
Who won?
Yeah, no. Yeah, it's interesting. So you had asked earlier about were other countries involved in the American Civil War. And what I always find so interesting is you do have observers, essentially European observers, that come over in the beginning of the American Civil War, and they watch the battles, right? And so you have European military officers who are I wonder how this new gun is going to work on the battlefield, or I wonder how this new military strategy is going to play out on the battlefield. And they come and they got their notebooks and they're just watching the Union and the Confederacy kill each other. American citizens as well went out and watched these fights. There are stories and illustrations of American aristocrats, and they've got their top hats and their monocles, and they pack a picnic lunch and they go and sit on the ridge and just watch a battle play out. It's still a time period where warfare is really romanticized. If it's viewed as a gentleman conflict. And the American Civil War is the first war that starts to show us what modern warfare is going to look like. And it's a little less,
meet here at 3 p.m.
Yeah, exactly. It's a little more okay, we're going to stay on our opposite sides, and then we'll agree to meet up and fight, and then we're, gonna follow the rules of war and all that stuff. This is the first conflict that essentially it's the first major conflict that shows what industrialized warfare is going to look like. We're in a time period where industrialization has boosted the economy. We can make things quicker and faster than ever before. And so what happens when you apply that factory system of making things to warfare? What happens when you take industrialization and instead of trying to make shoes, you try to make guns and you try to apply it to killing people? And the answer is it greatly increases our capacity to kill one another. And so that conflict kind of gives everyone on the world stage kind of war is going to kind of suck in the future, I think. And then whatever questions were opened up about that were firmly answered with our First World War. That's the one that really kind of is the mask off moment for war being just an awful thing.
What was the dirtiest war?
It's a general idea that war was fought as a gentleman's conflict. Even back in the gentleman wars of the 1700s, you did have instances where the rules of war weren't followed. But I would say, I don't know, I hate to be like stereotypical, but like World War I kind of ends the idea of a gentleman war, and then with World War II, all bets are off, right? In World War II, fights aren't happening on a battlefield, right? Like there's not just a place where the war is happening and then next door is like a town where the war isn't happening. The war is happening in towns. The war is happening in cities. Civilians, infrastructure, all this stuff is not viewed as being outside of targeting, right? They are the targets, and the goal is to, destroy everything, including civilians and towns, in order to get your enemy to capitulate.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Crazy. Can we go back to elections?
Sure, let's do it.
So back in 2000, Florida contested.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Okay, so we've had several elections, I think 5 total if I'm remembering correctly, in which you have the guy who wins the election, becomes the president, did not win the popular vote. All right, and so they did not get the most amount of votes. As you probably know, right, in our country here, we don't decide who becomes president based on who gets the most amount of votes. That's a component to it, but the ultimate, decision-making body is the Electoral College. And without getting into the weeds, because it's super boring, every state has a number of votes that they can cast, and essentially you win.
Based on population?
It is based on population, yeah. So places like California has 54 Electoral College votes. Texas has, I don't know, but a lot. New York.
Compared to Delaware.
Right, exactly. New York has a lot. Florida has a lot. And in the year 2000, Florida has 25 Electoral College votes. Night of the election, results are coming in. Al Gore, who's the Democrat nominee, and he's going up against George W. Bush, who's the Republican. Al Gore is looking like he's pulling ahead on the popular vote. But the Electoral College, the real important one, is undecided. And it seems like it's going to come down to Florida and their 25 Electoral College votes to determine who's going to get the presidency, right? As the night goes on, it looks like Bush has pulled away, and a number of news networks start to call the election for him. So much so that Al Gore actually ends up conceding the election. I believe he calls George Bush and says, like, congrats, you won. And then, like, the next day, there's a lot of questions about, like, wait, actually, I don't think that's the case. This is going to be so close that we're going to have a recount, right? We can't say for certain that Bush won. We're going to have to do a recount here. Al Gore ends up taking back his concession and saying, actually...
He calls George back up.
Yeah, he's like, actually, I take it back. I don't concede this election. I want the recount. So Al Gore and his group, they push for a recount in Florida. George Bush and his campaign challenge that and say, you can't do that. Like, you're not allowed to have a recount. We won. You already called the election, essentially.
Are they allowed to have a recount?
Yeah. So every state handles their elections differently. But, like, generally speaking, if it's going to come down to, we're talking hundreds of votes, not thousands, right? Hundreds of votes here. If it's that close, you're going to have a recount just to be certain. Al Gore wanted this recount to be done by hand. So, like, and this is the messy part of elections is, like, you have the average people who are like volunteering their time to like count ballots. So anyway, wanted to have this election recounted by hand. Bush challenges this. It goes to the Supreme Court. And in a decision that is a 5-4 decision in the Supreme Court called Bush versus Gore, the Supreme Court decides that you are not going to have a recount. The recount has to stop, and it's going to go to George W. Bush. The thing that becomes really controversial about this, there are many things, but one of the things that comes out that's controversial about this is that a lot of the ballots in Florida, if you actually look at them, like you have your paper in front of you, it's got all the candidates, they were really hard to read and hard to make sense of. Do you know what a butterfly ballot is? Okay, so essentially a butterfly ballot.
Do you get stamped?
Yeah. Okay, you got the little stamp thing, you like, fill in the bubble, right?
Right.
In a butterfly ballot, there are candidates on either side of that little stamp column. And if you looked at the Florida ones in certain counties, you would have like a candidate on one side and a bubble, and then there was a candidate on another side and a bubble right underneath it. and then there's another candidate over here and a bubble underneath it, and so on and so forth. It would like zigzag back and forth.
Kind of hard to read.
A little hard to read, because if you're reading it like a book, you're going to go like at the top is like, all right, George W. Bush, Republican, and then Al Gore, Democrat. And then you had Pat Buchanan over here on the other side who was running as a third party candidate. Most average people are going to read it like a book, and they would assume that the second bubble was for Al Gore because he's the second person on that list. Second bubble was for Pat Buchanan. And so you have a lot of research that had been done after the fact to show that there were probably a significant amount of people who ended up marking a vote for Pat Buchanan thinking they were voting for Al Gore. And it was, I think Bush ended up winning, the decisive county for Florida by like 537 votes, something like that. And there was enough people that probably made that mistake that it might have thrown the election to Gore. There was also famously the hanging Chad thing, which you probably remember. Where,
what's a hanging Chad?
So like again, elections, they're messy. Every state handles them differently. Every county in a state could handle them differently. So in some places in Florida, you had like a paper that you would punch a hole through, right? Like a hole punch. And then there were...
you would put your paper on the thing, and then you would stamp, and it would go through it, correct?
Right, it would punch through. And there were instances where like that little paper hole was still attached to the paper, and so it was like unclear if it was like an accidental mark for a vote or if it was supposed to be all the way punched through. It's why when you go in person now, most places, at least in California, are going to have electronic voting booths because it's just a little easier. You're not relying on pen and paper. But yeah, this is an election that even today people still say is a contested election, should have not been George W. Bush, should have been Al Gore. I mean, you can imagine how the last 20 years would be different if George W. Bush wasn't the president then.
What do they do with ballots once the election's done? The paper ballots.
That's a great question. Throw them in the garbage can? No, I'm sure they're incinerated. I don't know, but I would imagine they are like destroyed.
Oh. I'm just so confused how elections used to work. Even after George Washington.
Mm-hmm. So essentially the story of American political elections is the story of slowly expanding the right to vote to more and more people, right? I'm sure like most average people are probably not going to be surprised to learn that in the 1790s, you only were able to vote if you were a white man, right?
Did you have to have a certain amount of wealth?
So that's the thing that I would say maybe is perhaps a little less known, right? In the early days, you had to be a white man, but it actually wasn't enough to just be a white man. You had to be a white man in good public standing, meaning that you're like, a well-known community figure, right? You're a wealthy person, you're a politician, you're a businessman or whatever. You also had to own land. You had to own land, right? And so in the early part of the 1800s, like 1810s, 1820s, one by one, states begin to take away that land requirement. It's a time period in American history that is considered to be the creation of like a popular democracy, where it's not just landowners, but it's anyone who is a white man can now participate.
To expand the vote for more people.
Right, exactly. And it becomes less of a rich man's kind of country club game, and it becomes something that's expanded to the common American people. There's actually a lot of debates amongst our founding fathers as to whether or not giving the right to vote to people was a good thing or not. You have people like Alexander Hamilton, who famously is a total elitist and is basically saying the people are too stupid to vote. We can't let them have the right to vote. It's actually a bad thing if we just let every average person vote here because they don't know what they're talking about. And then you got people on the other side of it, figures more like your Thomas Jefferson types who are like, no, you should expand it to more and more people. Even he would have had his limitations, right? But he wasn't quite as elitist as Hamilton. It's funny because typically the first president that is considered to be elected by not just like an elite wealthy class, but by a group of people that's more representative of America is Andrew Jackson in 1828. And I think what's funny about him is emblematic of this like new kind of popular democracy system. He has his inauguration He ends up, giving a speech, doing what all presidents do. And then he ends up having an open public reception at the White House afterwards.
For everybody?
For everyone. The dude literally just opened up the doors of the White House and said, hey, guys, we're serving drinks at 5. Come on by. And so like a mob of people descend on the White House to go to this house party, essentially. And you've got like farmers and like people from the local pub just rolling in, drinking White House refreshments, knocking things over. There's a lot of property damage in the White House. By the time Jackson gets there, it is like a rager. It's a house party, like in a collegiate sense, honestly, going on, right? And so he goes and he ends up leaving. The only way they end up getting all of these people out of the White House to like kick them out is they take all the drinks, the alcohol that they're serving, and they set it up on the lawn in front of the White House. And so all the people start to move out and follow the alcohol. But it's wild to think about now that in the 1800s, you could have just gone to the president's house and said hi, shook his hand, and advocate for your own needs directly to the president. I mean, nowadays, that would never happen. You're not getting close to the president, right?
What kind of historical items are in the White House?
In terms of like artifacts, things like that. So we don't have our, the ones that you're probably thinking of, Declaration of Independence, Constitution, like the original documents. That's not going to be in the White House. I'd probably say the things of like the most value, right? Obviously, current government intel documents probably stored in the White House.
So like Andrew Jackson's pen is not in there?
No. So,
Still using it.
So every president gets to design their Oval Office, right? They get to decide what color the drapes are going to be, what color the carpet's going to be. They get to decide which portraits of important people they want. So I don't know which president, but theoretically, a president could have gotten a hold of an Andrew Jackson pen and say, oh, I want to display this in the White House, right? It's actually a really, highly talked about and controversial side of who gets elected to be president is like their interior design choices. When currently Joe Biden's the president as we're recording this, right? He's a lame duck president, but he's still the president. And he's a lame duck president.
What's that mean?
Meaning that he's on his way out. But anyway, he's president. He has in his Oval Office above the White House a huge portrait of FDR. And then on either side of it, I believe he's got Washington, Lincoln. I want to say Jefferson, and then I forget what the fourth one is. But I know that when Trump was in the White House, he had his giant portrait above the
Denzel Washington, LeBron,
Elon Musk, Arnold,
boys.
Arnold Palmer. No, he had George Washington above his White House fireplace or whatever. I believe he also had a bust of Andrew Jackson, which people criticized because Jackson has kind of a tough history when it comes to dealing with Native American populations. But a lot of commentators will really closely analyze which important people are kind of platformed in the Oval Office. It's all symbolism. It doesn't actually matter, but pundits like to talk about it.
Right.
Yeah. Who would be if you were president, who would be your portrait above the White House?
Just motivational people that I listen to, like David Goggins, Jocko.
Nice. Okay, sure.
People tell me I'm a bitch and I have to work harder.
Nice.
I'm just still blown away that the White House was burned down by the British.
Yeah. I mean, dirty of them. Talk about rules of war. That's totally unfair, right?
Did anyone get hurt during that?
I mean, yeah, sure. Lots of people died. Not the president. To my knowledge, not the White House staff. I mean, good news for us is that it was widely, I guess not reported in the traditional sense, but there was intelligence that the British were coming, right? So the president is out of there by the time they end up showing up.
How do they overpower us on our land? That's what I'm so confused.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, I don't know exactly the military answer to that, but found their way there, I guess. I mean, it's the United States is an expansive place, talking about a time period where, again, the technology is rather limited. So, if you're looking at a map and that map stretches as far as like New England, Maine, all the way down to Florida, right? And you got to defend the entire, not only coastline, but also the border on the western side of it from the British. British are bound to get in to certain places. So
Are we trying to retaliate after that?
In terms of like go to London and burn down the parliament or something?
Or even stop them from leaving?
I mean, certainly we're retaliating insofar as we're fighting back. We're trying to push them out, right? But, you know, outside of British Canada up north, there's not exactly a British White House equivalent that we can go, and burn down as well. But,
right.
Yeah.
So interesting.
Yeah. It's crazy to think that, because we're really obviously fortunate in the modern era that America, like, we haven't fought a war on our soil since what, like... closest we got was Spanish-American War in 1898. It was like the last time we had fighting like even close to our borders.
Would you consider Pearl Harbor?
Well, I guess that would
just
be
an attack.
Yes, yeah. So Pearl Harbor is, I guess, the official last time that American soil, again, excluding things like 9/11, right? But like in a war setting, last time that American soil was attacked. It's interesting too, actually. In World War II, we have Pearl Harbor most famously, but the Japanese end up attacking and occupying some of the Alaskan islands, like off the coast of Alaska up north, which no one cares about because, like, okay, you can have it. It's a little ice block. Yeah, enjoy it. Real strategic of you. But technically is American soil that was, like, briefly occupied.
And then what? They just left?
Yeah, I mean, it's not exactly the basis of an
what
attack.
What are we doing here?
Yeah. You're welcome. Go ahead. Sack Juneau, Alaska. That's going to really do you a huge favor in the war. But
you were talking about the founding fathers of some of them kind of having different ideas of what the country would be.
Sure, yeah.
They're all in their early 20s for the most part. How do they go about creating the rules and the laws for a brand new country that everybody has to abide by?
So you have, much like you would do today, you just get around in a room and you talk about it.
There's, how many are there? 13? 20?
In terms of founding fathers?
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of the notable ones, about that number, but there's several dozen
more people
significant people. Yeah. So, how we got our Constitution, right? We have in 1787, at this point, our first government system. It's called the Articles of Confederation. It's not good. Also, total snooze fest. So no need to go into it. But this government system wasn't working, and our like notable politicians, a lot of them being those founding fathers, right, are like, okay, we got to scrap this. We got to make something new. They come together in Philadelphia in 1787. They gather in Independence Hall in the middle of the summer. It is like 1 billion degrees, humid, hot, stuffy.
No air.
No air. They're shutting all of the windows, all of the doors. They're literally guards outside so that common people can't like go and like listen in on what all these people are doing. They know that they're revising the government, right? Like it's publicized that there are going to be some updates, but most average people think that it's just tweaks, right? And so surprise, surprise, when they come out and they're like, actually, we just got rid of the whole thing. We have a new constitution altogether. But in terms of how they did that, like they just sat around and negotiated. They went around and said, all right, like Rhode Island. Well, actually, Rhode Island was the one state that did not send delegates to that, but all the other. I'm sorry.
How come?
Rhode Island has a weird, like, anti-establishment history in the early days. They don't want to play nice with the other delegates from the other 12 colonies and now original states.
Were they trying to be independent?
So they definitely have an independent streak. What I think is interesting is we get this constitution, all the other 12 states have their delegates, they hash it out. Virginia gets what they need, Delaware gets what they need, whatever. And then they have to go and they got to ratify it. And so all of these states have to, essentially, their state governments have to approve the Constitution. They give it the thumbs up and say, yep, we accept it. All 12 eventually get there. It's like 1790. So this is, at this point, Washington is president, right? And Rhode Island is still a holdout. Like they don't want to ratify the Constitution. And all of the other 12 states eventually get together and say, fine, Rhode Island, you can do your own thing. Be your own country. Enjoy it, right? But we're not trading with you. We're not helping you. We're not going to allow any ships to like get in and out of your harbors. We're basically going to choke you into submission. And so Rhode Island ends up approving the Constitution only because they had to. Right? They were forced into it.
Who are the leaders that are holding out on this?
God, I don't know.
They just didn't want to be involved?
Yeah. Again, somebody who's like a Rhode Island historian is going to have a lot more depth than I would have. But I think it's a good example of this fundamental lack of unity that America has like always struggled with. You know, I think especially in today's modern era, you hear a lot about like, oh, the country is divided. It's a very divisive atmosphere right now. We all hate each other and stuff like that. And like, sure, yeah, I think that's true. And I think it's pretty bad right now. But we've always had these problems. Like throughout our history, it is a constant struggle to get the United States all on the same page. And I think that Rhode Island anecdote is a good example of that happening in the earliest days of our country.
Would they ever try and bring Puerto Rico as part of its states?
Sure. So Puerto Rico, Cuba was also like highly coveted by some of our founding fathers. I think it could be.
But they're independent now.
Sure. Yeah. Yes.
We're not involved.
Well, no. Puerto Rico is a territory for us.
I mean,
of
Cuba.
Yeah, but Cuba is its own thing or whatever. Funnily enough, the American South, in particular, politicians, important people from the South, really coveted a lot of those Latin American and Caribbean colonies, countries, and territories. If Southern politicians had it their way, America would have eventually gone in and annexed a lot of those territories and added them to the United States. And in particular, they wanted to add them there because they wanted them to become slave states and add to the slave state power in Congress. We're talking about like leading up to the American Civil War, right? Because obviously you get a new state. It's a slave voting state. You get new senators added to Congress. You get new representatives in Congress. You get just more political power. It doesn't end up happening, of course, but there were a lot of people that were hoping to do that.
How does America divide the line between us and Mexico? Like you say that everyone's trying to colonize and bring in new spots and new territory. But does Mexico have their own established line?
Sure.
Like, why didn't we expand even further?
Yeah. Okay. So we do expand a lot into Mexican territory.
Prior to where the border is now?
Yes. Well, so the thing is, what was considered Mexican territory was like California, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, like basically all of the American Southwest.
That was originally Mexico.
That was Mexican territory, well, Spanish territory, and then they have their own War of Independence and get rid of the Spanish colonial overlords, become Mexico, their own country. So they've got all of the American Southwest. America in the 1840s essentially picks a fight with Mexico to try and initiate a war.
Are we bored?
No, so we want that territory.
Oh,
like we're like that would be super sweet if we could just have that. This is a time period where America is really drinking the Kool-Aid of manifest destiny, which is like
move out west.
Yeah, it's a key term that like I'm sure every history teacher in America has said many times. But yeah, you got it right. The idea is that we have a destiny to expand from coast to coast, and Mexico's in the way. So we actually initially send diplomats to Mexico City. With like, I think it's like $20 million and try to buy that territory.
Of U.S. dollars?
Yeah, like, or, gold currency,
right.
Whatever the currency is. Try to buy that territory from Mexico. Mexico says, absolutely not. We're not selling. And we're like, all right, fine. We'll just take it then. They go, it's tough to explain without a map, but there is a disputed border along Texas. You know that if you're imagining in your head, right, the Texas border right now along the south, it's the Rio Grande River, right? You get a general idea. America at that time claimed that our territory expanded all the way to the Rio Grande River. Mexico says it doesn't, that it actually, their territory goes up to the Rio Grande and past that a little bit. So there's a little bit of a border dispute. America sends troops, like the military, to that border. And the instructions are go in, like, again, pick a fight with them, like make a big scene and try and get the Mexican government to like fire upon you first. Mexico ends up taking the bait. They end up firing upon the American military. American military fires back. And now the president, James K. Polk, he's got the justification needed to launch a wider war against Mexico. It's the Mexican-American War. Which is another one that's often forgotten.
What year?
What is it? Oh, gosh, you're testing me. I know it ends in 1848, and I want to say it begins in 1845. Folks in the comments will correct me on that. But it's like mid-1840s. So it's a relatively quick war. America absolutely cleans up. I mean, this is not a fair fight. Mexico's government at this time is dealing with a lot of corruption. They've had a number of leaders kind of cycle in and out in the years before, so they're not very politically strong, and the American military is just kind of a class above them. So we defeat them in that war. We end up extracting what's called the Mexican Cession from Mexico. And in addition to getting that disputed territory that we talked about in Texas settled in favor of America, we get all of the American Southwest. We get all of the territory that's going to become New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and California. And that's how we fill in basically the southwestern part of our map. And in many ways, that's like a completion of sorts of Manifest Destiny. Oh. So, yeah, it's funny because I just love the idea of like we try and buy it and they say no. I'm like, all right, we'll just shoot you until you give it to us.
And they baited them into that.
Yeah, and they baited them into it. So there's a series of congressional debates where there are certain congressmen who are not as pleased in what they view as kind of like warmongering, essentially, like we are doing something that you could say is unethical. And so there are congressmen who are saying that they don't believe in this kind of story that Polk is selling to the American people, which is that Mexico fired upon us first and we were attacked, so we have to defend ourselves. There are politicians that are demanding in Congress at this time that the president point out the exact spot on the map where Mexico fired and where like American blood was spilled. And the guy who is leading the kind of spot argument of like where on the map did this happen was Abraham Lincoln, back when he was like a congressman and before he was obviously the figure that we know him to be. He gets the nickname Spotty Lincoln because he keeps talking about where's the spot on the map where this happened. Like you can't prove that they actually fired upon us first here. But he is a minority voice in an otherwise very pro-war American government at this time.
Is there a lot of debate now about things like that of where the first shots were fired? Because how do you even prove that at this point?
Sure.
Hundreds of years later with nothing being written down.
So I would say like I don't know. I'm not aware of any like hard evidence that says, yes, this was the spot on the map. Lincoln was right and we vindicate him all these years later. But it is well established and accepted that, again, America baited Mexico, that this was not a fair battle or a fair, justification for war.
What about in the north with our neighbors in Canada? Did we try and expand even further, but then Canada ever fought us to say this is where it ends?
Yeah, no. So we do have a couple of border disputes that are settled. The names of these treaties escape me. I apologize to my APUSH students. I'm a bad example, but yeah, we essentially with British Canada, we used more of the diplomatic route to establish our northern border, to establish where the border is in like modern day, like Washington State, Oregon State, as and settle kind of where the British side is and the American side. We do some border dispute diplomacy with the Maine border, also up in the northeastern part of America. But a lot of that is settled through just pen and paper rather than through warfare. And I think you could probably chalk that up to Britain is just a far more powerful foe. And so we could pick a fight with Britain like we did with Mexico, but it probably won't go quite as well as it did for us when you're talking about the Mexican-American War.
Oh, yeah. Interesting. Benjamin Harrison's victory balls.
Yeah.
What's that?
Okay, so Benjamin Harrison has some balls. Okay, we're used to...
Is he a former president?
He's a former president. He's the guy I was saying that beat Grover Cleveland and then was president and then lost.
Right.
In his election campaign, I want to say for 1888. Yeah, it's 1888. He's running against Grover Cleveland. This is a time period where presidential elections look very different. We're used to today the rallies, right? We're used to our politicians, Trump, Harris going out and like they are the ones leading the campaign on the campaign trail. Back in the day, in the 1800s, the president didn't, or the person who wanted to be president didn't go out and like campaign for themselves directly.
People did
on their behalf, right? But they typically stay in Washington or their home state or wherever they are, right? So this is an era where our concept of like a modern political election season is very different from what we have now. In addition to having the candidates out on the campaign trail, we're also used to campaign gimmicks, right? Every time you get you get a campaign election or election campaign put together, you get the symbols, buttons. You get the buttons, you get the phrases, make America great again, I like Ike, hope, change, all these things that become very commonplace for us and household phrases. This is prior to that era, but it is a time period where politicians are starting to kind of move in that direction. So Harrison is credited with kind of giving us one of our first great campaign gimmicks. And it's actually in reference to his grandfather, who was president before him back in 1840, who did the same thing. His campaign constructed these huge balls, like literally a massive sphere, that they rolled across the country from state to state, from city to city, and it would be like this big event, right? It'd be
How huge? Like the size of a car?
Yeah, like massive. Yeah, and they're in, not for the 1840 version of it, but for the 1888 version, there are pictures of this. You can go online and see these balls. And so Harrison's rolling his balls through all these various, important cities that he wants to get attention for his campaign for. They've got like little campaign slogans and promises written on them, and it's supposed to attract public attention. And you can imagine if you're like living in some small farmer town in the Midwest somewhere.
I'm going to vote for that guy.
Yeah, and this guy rolls his balls through town. You're like, oh man, he must be pretty cool. I mean, he put this together. So it's a spectacle, right? And it's one of our fun early examples of a political spectacle and a campaign strategy that you might see today.
Did he go through that himself, pushing those through?
No, well, again, that's the thing. He's not doing it. He's just staying at home, and his people go out and roll his balls for him.
Do all of the presidents in the past move to the White House once they win?
That's a good question. I think so. With varying degrees of
travel and vacations,
right, and also varying degrees of maybe how long they would stay there as well. A lot of presidents have what they call their winter White House or their summer White House.
Right.
Like Trump's Mar-a-Lago is considered his winter White House. There are other examples that escape me where essentially presidents have their mansions, their homes in other states. Biden has his home in Wilmington, Delaware,
yes,
which he spends a lot of time at. So it will vary president to president, but you are right in kind of your question there that there are cases where presidents will maybe not spend that much time at all at the White House, and the White House more becomes like a symbolic kind of place where if they're signing a bill or if they're hosting a world leader, they're going to do that there at the White House. It'd be interesting to read about various presidents, how much they used it. But I think the idea that like in the Oval Office, a president is sitting there, late at night, writing something down or working on a computer at the Resolute desk doesn't happen.
Right.
It's for photo op.
What's the significance of a presidential library?
So it's all about PR, right? It's all about your legacy. It's about how you want your presidency and your story to be told. They are usually crafted through some sort of foundation that a president will put together. The first one we get is Herbert Hoover. I actually forget where his is located, but he's the first president to have one of these. And then every president since then has had their presidential library be created at some point after their life. California is really lucky. We have a bunch of them. We obviously have the Reagan Library. We have in Orange County, Nixon has his presidential library there. In Texas, you've got the LBJ Library. I believe Obama's is in Chicago. Trump's library hasn't been constructed yet, but probably will be in Florida. You would guess.
It picks wherever significance is of them.
Yeah, usually it's like in a hometown or wherever they consider to be their home, right? Even if it wasn't where they were born, it's where they spent most of their life, right? And
it's the history of their life and when they got into politics, when they won.
Yeah, definitely. It tells their story, right? So if you go to the Reagan Library, which is probably the closest one to you and I right now.
And there's a plane in there too.
Yeah, so the Reagan Library has Air Force One. Funnily enough, my high school usually does prom at the Reagan Library, like underneath.
In that hangar?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it's kind of cool.
Wait, the one you teach at or the one you went to?
One that I teach at. Yeah, so pretty cool. Or at least I think so. I don't know. Maybe the students think it's weird, but I'm like, what the heck? Prom at a presidential library? Sign me up. That sounds awesome.
As a history teacher, that's sick.
Yeah, it's great. But they're basically just museums, right? Like you go through and there'll be exhibits and artifacts from their campaign and their administration. And you have to be an educated like patron of those libraries because they are telling you a narrative, right? Like they're not going to be critical of that president. They're not going to be like, here's all the dirty bad things that they did. It's going to be a very, rose-colored glasses story. So you got to understand that going in, that you should probably look up other books and other pieces of evidence to find out more about the presidency. But, at the end of the day, it's still kind of a cool piece of history that you get to go and visit if you want. So
can we talk about your time as a teacher right now?
Go for it. Yeah. What do you got?
So last time you spoke about how ChatGPT was killing the American teaching system.
Education system.
Education system.
Yeah.
Is ChatGPT a problem amongst high school students now?
I would say, I think we've gotten to the point where most classes, most teachers have adjusted to that.
Allow it?
I mean, hopefully not allow it. I would say that would be bad, of course. But I think it's a matter of like doing things old school, pen and paper in the classroom to try and limit the ability that you have to cheat. Now, again, every high schooler watching me right now is thinking to themselves, Mr. Wyllie, you can do what you want to do. We still know how to get around it. And, and I'm sure that's the case. And it makes me sad, frankly. A little part of me dies every single time you cheat in my class.
Do you catch students cheating?
Oh, yeah. I had a cheating scandal last year that nearly broke me.
What happened?
Well, I don't want to get into it too much, but I just I found out that somebody had been distributing test answers, from one of my periods to the other class periods. And like again, I'm gonna tell my sad sob story now of like how that genuinely hurt me, and I told them like the next day I went to all my class periods and I'm like, listen, I know that this happened. I'm aware that this happened. I just want you to know you have broken my heart, and for those who were a part of this, like you're dead to me. Like I'm so disgusted with your behavior.
Did you catch all the students who did it?
Well, the problem is I knew that it happened, but I did not have any sort of proof that would hold up in like an actual report. So they got away with it. Good. If you're watching it, good on you. You got away with it, but you made me feel so bad. Which again, they're like, I don't care. But you have to have tough skin, and I'm learning that as a teacher that it's gonna happen, and I will do my best to make it so it doesn't happen, and make multiple versions of the test and try to design questions that are difficult to cheat on. But I know it happens. But just so you know, students, I'm aware of your game, and it hurts me. And so if you've ever had a teacher who's like dead inside and you're like, oh, this teacher doesn't care about me or teaching, and they're not doing their best every day, it's probably because of years and years and years of cheating wearing them down. So when you see your teacher's light extinguish behind their eyes, it's because of cheating.
As a teacher, do you run through your students' tests and answers? Do you run it through AI technology kind of thing to see if it was ever plagiarized?
Yeah. So if I'm doing writing, like if it is a writing that could be cheated on, if you can use AI, they do have systems that you can run it through and they can like flag.
Do you test every single one?
So typically for my tests, I've transitioned this year to having my assessments be only multiple choice.
It's only verbal talking face to face.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's one-on-one. It takes me 2 months to do one test for every student, but no. It's all multiple choice. So I don't need to worry about like ChatGPT in that sense because they're taking the test in the classroom. It's pen and paper. They're not going to be able to pull up ChatGPT because I'll see them do it. So I don't have to worry about that. And then all of the writing that I do in class, it's very like opinion based, a very much like you're making arguments, but you're getting to argue for what you believe. And rather than just like, oh, write me an essay on how the Federalist Papers impacted our Constitution or whatever, like some question like that, you know, immediately you could just have ChatGPT do that. It's like, oh, instead my questions are like, oh, write me your thoughts on like America's war on drugs and drug policy and whether or not you think we should decriminalize drugs.
Oh,
like,
so they have to be aware of the subject.
Yeah. So you know, the way that I think about it is that that's a question that is going to be hopefully of interest to them. So they just will be interested in like coming up with their opinion, which will hopefully lead them to not want to cheat on it. And also, you know, again, like, you know, you're going to have that is a question that requires a little bit more of you rather than just like cold facts that could be looked up on ChatGPT. So that's the idea. It's funny because, you know, it's fall right now. It's college application season for seniors.
Do people ask you for recommendations?
Yep. Yeah, I did.
Do you ever say no?
Not as much as I should. Last year, I wrote like 22 letters of rec, which was way too much. Like I was being stupid because I couldn't say no. I was like, oh, I would love to. I'm so happy to write you a letter of rec. You were a great student. We had a great rapport. I got it down to only, I think, 11 or 12 this year. Some teachers are intense. They're like 5, and you have to interview, and you have to like, you know, prove that you are worthy of this letter of rec and like a number of things. So every teacher is going to do it a little differently. But anyway, yeah.
22.
So 20 is so stupid. And then like, it's completely my fault. Like I'd be looking at my colleagues and I'm like, I'm dead. I have to write 22 letters of rec this weekend. And they're like, why did you do that? I'm like, cause I have no ability to say no. Like I just, man, it's because I'm a newer teacher. Like, I'm sure when I'm 20 years in, somebody will ask me, like, can I have a letter of rec? I'm like, no, you suck. But now I can't do it. But,
do you see older teachers in the system have that kind of attitude?
I think in general, the longer you're in the game,
you have more backbone, more skin.
Well, you get a little more hardened. Let's say, you know, you get a little more willing to have those tough conversations and tell kids no and all that. And I think it's natural for newer teachers. You're so focused on like trying to create a good classroom environment, and you know, you're also just focused on like putting your curriculum together. That I think it lends itself to maybe wanting to people please a little bit more. And I even noticed myself in the 5 years that I've been teaching, I've gotten a lot more willing to say no, willing to hold the line on arguments with students or whatever, which doesn't happen all the time for me, but like I have noticed myself getting a little more of that kind of like hardened attitude. But yeah, certainly veteran teachers are going to be a little more willing to do that.
What does it take for you to give up on a student?
If I see them with AirPods in their ear more than one time, then
while you're in the class?
Yeah. No,
people just do that and
every day. I start every class saying cell phones away, AirPods out of your ears.
What are they listening to? Music?
Yeah. For sure. It was hilarious. Literally just yesterday, as 5th period, and I go to start a lecture, and all of us, I'm like maybe 5 minutes in, and I hear like rock music. I'm like, what the heck? And I look over to the side, to the right of me, and a student has like a AirPod, and it wasn't even an AirPod. It was like an old school headphone that had like a wire, and it's just a wire down. And I look at him, and like I'm laughing. I'm not even mad. I'm just like, dude, if you're gonna tune me out, be better about it. Like I can hear you. And so, you know, obviously I tell them to put it away and all that, but it's so funny. Yeah, it's a constant daily struggle. And so that's a good example of like some teachers being a little more hard ass than I am. I'm willing to like have that reminder every day of like, hey guys, time to start, put your phones away, put your stuff away. There are some teachers that I know who will be like, first day of class, they'll be like, this is a no AirPod class. And if I see you with AirPods, it's a detention immediately. And so next day, if there's an AirPod, there isn't a warning. It's just like, here's your detention. You're done. You're going to have to give me a couple hours after school now.
I can't believe AirPods are even a thing. Like it's a problem.
Oh, it is the bigger problem. Like more so than kids just being on their phone and like playing Clash of Clans or Brawl Stars or whatever else is popular right now. It is the AirPods listening to music, or that is easily the biggest battle that I have every day.
You want to call them out right now? Who are the kids' names?
You know who you are. You know who you are.
Hey, if they're watching this an hour in, they want to learn. They want to learn.
Yeah, that would be great. Well, it'd be crazy if the AirPod kid was watching this an hour in, because when you have to be in class, you're listening to music. And if you're watching this now, you're doing that on your own time, voluntarily. So
maybe he's listening to your past episodes.
Could be. That'd be impressive.
While he's in your lecture.
Oh, you know what? If that's the case, then I'm okay with it. I'll let you listen to your AirPods.
So people can listen to this podcast in your class.
That is the only thing I'll allow. Yeah. But only the 3 episodes of Lightweights that I've been on. None of the other ones. Those you have to do on your own time.
It's so funny. What other issues are there in your classroom?
I mean, I feel pretty fortunate that I don't have a lot of
Because you're like a young,
issues.
cool teacher.
Yeah. I mean, that's always the thing. I feel like we might have talked about this on previous episodes, but it's like the pros and cons of
being the young guy,
of being a young teacher versus being an older teacher, right? I think like as a young teacher, you get kind of an immediate rapport,
more respect
with students. Well, no, the opposite of that. I would say you get immediate rapport.
Well, I think respect on like the we're peers kind of level,
sure,
which maybe
yeah.
you don't want.
Yeah, right. So you get the rapport, you get like the immediate like oh, this teacher speaks my language. They know like the terminology, they play the games that I play, they listen to the music that I play and all that stuff. So I think there's like an immediate buy-in when students walk in and they see a younger teacher. Theoretically they're more willing to like open up and be a part of the class. However, I think at least you get a lot more pushback as well, because they're like, wait a second, you're my brother's age. Like, I'm not listening to you. Oh my God, the funniest thing when I was student teaching, and I love this. I remember, student teaching, I was doing something or whatever, and passing papers out. And I walk by a student and she looks at me and she's like, how old are you? And at the time I was 24. So I'm like, I'm 24. And she's like, they let you teach us? And I'm like, I know. Like, can you believe it? Like, I'm just as surprised as you are that they put me in charge of all of you guys. Like, not so much now, but like in the first couple years of my career, I'd have these moments where I'm teaching and I'm like looking around the room. And I'm just like, they're doing something, not even looking at me, they're taking a test. And I just have this moment of realization of like, wow, I'm in charge of like 37 16-year-olds right now. Like it's crazy. But
is that how many kids are in your class? 37?
At my most populated class is 37.
Do you have a teacher's assistant?
I do, actually. In that class, the 37th student is my TA. Shout out to my TA. He's awesome.
Your student is the TA?
A former student. I taught him last year.
Oh.
But yeah, so I mean, typically when you get a TA, at least in my experience, when I've had them, they've been like former students who are really, they're just like, hey, I need an extra period, and like I liked your class, can I come hang out?
Oh, so they're not paid.
Oh no.
Oh.
They're like a senior,
Oh.
And I don't have a lot for them to do. They typically my only requirement for being a TA for me is like, are you cool? Like, can I talk to you? Can we have
like as a peer?
Yeah, can we have conversations about stuff? And provided you're cool and I like you, then great, you can be my TA.
Is there a lot of juicy gossip between the teachers amongst the students who are problems?
Gossip amongst the teachers about students?
Yeah, like Aiden in third period did this. Yeah. Oh, I hated his brother. He's the worst.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Like, we know. That's the thing. I mean, again, maybe students are aware of this. I'm not sure. But like when students come into the classroom and they're somebody who has had discipline issues or whatever, we know everything about you.
Because you guys are all talking to each other.
We're all talking. And also, like, we've got the computer system that has, like, your records from when you were a kindergartner all the way up to now. So I can see every single, suspension, referral issue that you've had. And I am aware of, like, what you might have done in other classes that could have been problematic. Now, actually, for me as a teacher, I tend to not look at those things because I don't like to start day one and have like a preconceived idea of what a student might be like. I find that it actually just makes me nervous, right? It makes me kind of anxious if I'm like, oh my God, I have a student and last year he punched a teacher or something, like that would make me nervous. That hasn't happened, but like as an example, right? Like I almost don't want to know, because then I'm gonna see, you know, Jack or whatever, and I'm gonna be nervous around them. Whereas I'd like to just be ignorant and make my own assessment. But I mean, the information is all there, and I do think that there are probably some teachers who, first day of the school year, before everyone gets there, they look through and they see, all right, who have been my problem students in the past and who are going to be the good ones and all that. So,
right.
But yeah, I mean, I tend to like to form my own opinions if I can.
I would have loved to be in your class.
I would have loved to have had you, Joe.
So I know we're coming to a time where we have to call it.
Sure.
But I would love to go over the most forgettable president.
Okay.
William Harrison.
William Harrison.
The most forgettable president.
Okay. William Harrison, most forgettable president. He is the originator of the victory balls that we were talking about earlier. So that might make him kind of memorable, although I think Benjamin, his grandkid, did it better in the late 1800s. But the reason I'd say he is forgettable is that this is the guy who, his nickname was Old Tippecanoe. Old Tippecanoe, because he had a battle that earned this nickname or whatever. So Old Tippecanoe. He ends up winning the election in 1840, gets elected. He's inaugurated.
Are you saying tip a canoe?
Tip a canoe.
Like he tips canoes?
I think it's the name. I should know this, again. Shame on me as a teacher, but I think it's like a battle location or something that he fought at and had some sort of great victory, war hero type of thing. So Old Tippecanoe. He gets elected. You're elected in November. At the time, inaugurations were in March, not in January. So there's like a long period of time that you're just sitting there like waiting to be president, essentially. He has his inauguration, and famously on his inauguration day, it's outside and the weather is just awful. It's like raining, right? And so he's given this speech in the rain and it's just terrible weather. He ends up walking home or whatever. Next day, he's not feeling well, and he ends up catching a cold. And 3 weeks after becoming president, he dies. So he really isn't a president at all. He's only ever been president for 3 weeks.
And this is his first term?
This is his first term, right? His life's work. He's this war hero. He's finally ascended up the ranks to be president, and the guy dies of a cold or pneumonia or whatever within 3 weeks of his presidency. The reason I call him forgettable as well is that on presidential rankings, he typically is just left off the rank. They don't even talk about him. They don't even rank him because they're like, there's nothing to assess.
Wow.
Yeah. So poor Tippecanoe. He never had his chance.
And his VP took over.
Yeah. Tyler. Because that was the thing. The phrase, the campaign slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So fun fact.
Presidential rankings they're kind of just whatever, right?
Well, it's opinion, right? Like it's just
public opinion, but like, isn't it like, whose opinion is it?
It's typically it'll be like historians like me will be asked to like assess presidents, or maybe not even be asked. Actually, they might just say like, I want to do a ranking or whatever, and it'll come out of like collegiate institutions. So like the ones that you hear about are coming from like the academic world. And they're going to, assess foreign policy, domestic policy, temperament, scandals, all these things. And that's how they'll come up with their rankings. I think that they're helpful, and I think that they're pretty accurate for our non-modern presidents. I think it's really hard to assess the success of a president, before you get 20 years out. Because you have to like let time pass to see
how their policies play out.
See how and also like we're so passionate about things in the moment, whereas as time goes on, you become a little more sober about how you're looking at these people, and you can better assess them without maybe that bias that you would be holding.
So are Obama's rankings changing? Clinton's rankings still changing even now?
Yeah, totally. So Obama tends to rank pretty high. I think Clinton does too, because outside of the Monica Lewinsky scandal, he was pretty popular. But yeah, every I think like 2 years you'll get a major one, and you'll typically have some sort of shuffling. However, that being said, the bottom three and the top three are usually pretty consistent.
Who's the top three?
I was gonna say, do you have any guesses as who the top three are? I bet you could guess.
Top three presidential rankings
In no particular order, but
Lincoln.
Yep.
For sure.
Yeah.
Washington?
100%. And number three would be the one that probably cycles the most too. Like in terms of getting a different opinion every so often.
Or Reagan?
No, Reagan is pretty popular, which is interesting because not my favorite president, but
he was beloved, right?
He was very popular in the 1980s. I think his policies have soured considerably, but
Nixon. No, I'm kidding.
Definitely not Richard Nixon. No, I think most recently it was FDR.
Oh, okay.
Wartime president, gets us out of the Great Depression. So he's up there a lot. Teddy Roosevelt, very, very popular as well.
JFK?
JFK is popular, however, obviously only serving for like 3 years because of the assassination. I think it hampers his
overall.
Yeah, not because he wasn't popular. He was beloved. In fact, he's like one of our first celebrity presidents. The idea that we're interested in the families of presidents really does come from JFK. Like, you know, his presidency and the White House was called Camelot, because people were so interested in his family, and, you know, obviously has his wife being like a fashion icon and a first lady that gets a lot of publicity. Anyway, JFK is pretty popular, but you know, not around as long as some of the other guys. Any idea who the bottom ones are?
Who are the bottom 3 presidential rankings?
So right now, I just double checked this morning, Donald Trump is the lowest ranked president.
Wow.
Which I think this is a good example of current bias and passions influencing that ranking. You know, like Trump is the most polarizing American alive right now. Like every person has an opinion on Donald Trump, no matter what. And he's unpopular. Like he's just objectively not a super popular president, despite winning this past election. And he did, you know, good on him. But he's not usually viewed as an overwhelmingly popular president. I wouldn't be surprised if, as time moves on, he comes up a little bit.
Who are the other bottom 10?
So you'll see James Buchanan, who is the president in 1856 to 1860.
Civil War?
Right before the Civil War. So he's blamed as being a president who was inept and did nothing to stop the Civil War. And notably as well, after Lincoln wins the election in 1860, as I said, you win the election in November, and then it's not till March of the next year that the guy takes over. So Lincoln wins. He's not going to take over to March. In December of 1860, you get South Carolina as the first state to secede from the Union. And historians really blame James Buchanan for not doing more to try and stop South Carolina and then all the other states from leaving, right? And there's a lot of blame that's put on his shoulders for, like, you didn't stop it, you let them all leave, and then Lincoln takes over, and he basically takes over in a major national crisis. So he's ranked really low. Also, fun fact for him, or sad fact, he's the only president we've ever had who was never married. Bachelor his whole entire life.
Wow.
Yeah, so he was a loser as a president and in his personal life.
Was he dating throughout presidency?
I don't know. I actually have no idea about his dating life, but he wasn't very successful. So
interesting that helped him back then, because you think they'd want a person with a family life.
Yeah, I don't know if it helped him, but I think that would be a product of a time period where, again, media is hampered by the lack of technology. You know, certainly today, if you're a bachelor, you're not winning the presidency. You can't even win the presidency if you have a beard. Like, if you don't have a wife or a spouse of any type, like, you're not going to be elected.
You think a beard affects presidency?
When's the last time we had a president with facial hair?
Early 1900s?
William Howard Taft had a big old mustache. That was the last time we had facial hair for a president.
So you think that people would shave it to be...
People do shave it. Yeah. What's a good example? Well, okay, so Ted Cruz, when he was running for president, he didn't have the beard that he has now, as one example. Well, it's interesting, actually. J.D. Vance, who's going to be vice president, he has a beard.
He's the first one.
First person, I guess, on the ticket to have facial hair, as far as I'm aware, since William Howard Taft. So,
wow.
You know, again, I don't have a lot of good things personally to say about J.D. Vance, but if he can make beards popular again, then I guess that'd be pretty cool.
Wasn't there a president who was never elected?
Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford is the president that nobody wanted. Poor Gerald Ford. So, first of all, Gerald Ford, he was a high-ranking Republican in Congress in the early 1970s.
It's kind of recent.
Yeah, pretty recent. I mean, on a historical timeline, certainly the 70s isn't that far away. High-ranking Republican, well-liked, well-regarded by most of his peers. It's the early 1970s. There's a Republican in the White House. It's Richard Nixon, of course. Nixon, and his vice president at the time was a guy named Spiro Agnew, which is one of the craziest names in politics in our history, for sure. So Spiro and Richard Nixon. Nixon gets elected in 1972 to a second term. Within that first year of his new second term administration, his vice president, Spiro, gets caught up in some sort of criminal investigation. Like it was something to do with bribery and some sort of financial conspiracy. I don't remember the details, but point is here, he is wrapped up in this conspiracy, and he ends up getting kicked off of the ticket. He steps down as VP.
He resigns on his own?
He resigns, yeah. He's kicked out of it and because of the scandal, right? And so Nixon needs to fill the vice presidency role, and he ends up asking Gerald Ford to take over. Now, Ford...
As VP.
Yeah, to be second in command here. It's a pretty good gig because at the time, this is prior to all the Watergate stuff coming out. Nixon has just won his election, and he's pretty popular. I mean, he got elected twice, and it wasn't particularly close. So for Ford, you're thinking like, all right, get to be VP, get to do it for 4 years. Famously, the job of a vice president is absolute fluff. Like, you don't do anything as VP. You're a symbol. You're an in case of emergency break glass type of person, right? Ford famously, it's reported, was considering retiring before being asked to be VP. He was like towards the end of his political life. And so he thought about it, and he's thinking to himself, what the heck? What a great kind of like last hurrah for my career. I get to be vice president of the United States and the second in command theoretically here. This will be great in a couple of years when I'm retired and I'm like on the golf course some year. I get to talk about how I was vice president. So he takes over, and of course, as we all know, right, within a year of that, now all of the Watergate stuff comes out. Nixon's embroiled in controversy. He ends up Nixon stepping down himself because of the Watergate scandal. It's obvious that he's going to be impeached, and it is very clear that the House of Representatives will impeach him, and the Senate is very likely to vote to remove him from office. So rather than be humiliated, Nixon steps down. Again, if he didn't, he would have been removed more than likely. So that's the end of his presidency. And now Gerald Ford is ushered into the role of being the president. And it makes him distinct because he is the only person to serve as the leader of a presidential administration to never be elected to that role. He was not elected to president, and he wasn't elected to vice president either. So he's the most powerful person in the world, I guess in the world, but he was not elected democratically at all.
Was he stoked to be that position?
I don't think so. Right? Gerald Ford, again, was hoping to retire. I don't think he ever wanted to take on this level of responsibility. So he ends up being president for the year of 1975 and 1976. He does end up running for president again in 76 against Jimmy Carter.
Just to keep the party going?
I think at that point, to be fair, I haven't read like the Ford biography. Maybe at that point he was a little more interested in pursuing this for his legacy, but I also wouldn't be surprised if it was just a matter of like, he kind of got the ball rolling, like what the heck, give it another 4 years or whatever. He loses that election, so he gets his retirement that he wants anyway. But so he, is unlike other presidents, because you could say like, okay, well, JFK is assassinated and then LBJ becomes president. But LBJ was on the ticket when JFK was elected, so people did technically vote for him, right? And so anytime you had a VP take over, they were theoretically democratically put in that position. Gerald Ford was not. Ford, too, I don't know if you know this, but it's like one of my favorite things about him is he's famous for being a klutz. And like he just falls over in public all the time. Like you can find videos of him walking down Air Force One, the steps from Air Force One, and he slips and falls down the whole steps. And you know how like SNL, right, is famous for their presidential impersonations? The first president to be impersonated was Gerald Ford. You have Chevy Chase in the 1970s, who basically the whole joke is that Chevy Chase, as Gerald Ford, walks up to a podium and he just knocks things over and he just like falls all over the place. So The reason that we get that kind of SNL tradition is because Ford was so laughable.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's funny, too, because Ford is arguably one of the most athletic presidents we've ever had. I think, if I'm not mistaken, he was, like, on his college football team. Like, you look at his background, and he should be one of the more, like, physically capable presidents, but he's the one that's known for tripping and fumbling and falling over. It's hilarious.
Your wealth of knowledge is so impressive and so cool.
I appreciate it. Yeah, I try my best to shove facts up here so I can spit them out.
Do you just remember it immediately? You have, like, photographic memory?
Definitely not photographic memory. You know, I got to brush up every so often, but one of the benefits of being a teacher is that, you know, over the years you do this a lot, and you have these things kind of set in. So, and I love it. I really do. Like, I'm a history nerd. I am a teacher because I love teaching and I love working with kids, and I would say that's probably the number one reason I want to be a teacher. And I am a teacher, but I also happen to be somebody who finds this stuff super interesting.
Are you good with world history too? Like the gladiators of Italy and Rome?
Yeah, not as much, because as a high school history teacher in 10th grade, our world history class, which I have taught, typically starts at the 1700s. So all of the ancient history stuff, knights, samurai, Vikings.
That's more college stuff?
Middle school and college as well. But in terms of like your required education, that's going to be stuff in like 6th and 7th grade.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I'd love to do another one in the future.
Let's do it.
Thanks for coming by.
Appreciate it, Joe.
What do you, so you don't have your podcast anymore?
I have nothing to plug. I'll tell you this. For any of my students watching right now.
SAT's coming up 3 months.
Open the study guide. I know you haven't opened the study guide. I look at the Google Doc activity page and I can see who has accessed it. And I know that 90% of my students look at the study guide the night before the test. But please... I don't have an Instagram to follow. I don't have a podcast you need to listen to. Just open the study guide for me. That'd be great.
Thanks for coming by.
Appreciate it.
Oh, it's out. That was so good.
I feel like we like really got into the weeds on some. I was like